Close your eyes for a moment and imagine the world in early January 1709. The year had just turned, and in towns and villages across Europe, life still moved with the same rhythm it always had. Farmers tended to their animals, merchants unpacked goods at market stalls, and families warmed themselves beside modest fires. The cold season was no stranger, of course. Winter always came, and with it came snow, wind, and the occasional hard frost. But this was different. This was a winter unlike anything anyone alive had ever seen. The night of January 5th bled into the morning of January 6th, and across the continent, something extraordinary began to unfold. In Paris, water inside clay jugs froze solid, splitting the vessels apart. In Rome, fountains that had run continuously for centuries stiffened into grotesque, icy statues. In the German states, rivers stiffened in their beds, their flowing waters halted as if time itself had stopped. Even the sea, near parts of the Dutch coast, turned to glass, trapping fishing boats in silent prisons of ice. At first, many people simply thought it was another spell of bitter weather. They wrapped their cloaks tighter, threw extra wood onto the fire, and waited for the frost to lift. But it didn't lift. Day after day, the cold deepened. The air itself seemed heavier, sharper, slicing through wool, fur, and skin with equal cruelty. Breathing burned the lungs. Ears, noses, and fingers turned black at the tips, the first signs of frostbite spreading quietly through towns and countryside alike. No corner of Europe was spared. From the farmlands of Poland to the vineyards of France, from the mountains of Switzerland to the flat, damp marshes of England, the frost spread like an invisible army. And it brought with it not only bitter winds but also silence. Birds fell dead from the sky. Livestock froze in barns. The normal chorus of life, dogs barking, carts creaking, children shouting in the streets, faded into stillness. All that remained was the groaning of trees snapping under the weight of ice and the distant wails of those already suffering. Imagine being a villager then, stepping outside your small home on that first week of January. Your boots crunch against snow so hard and dry it sounds like glass beneath your feet. The smoke from your chimney rises weakly before freezing into crystals that hang in the air. The sky above is clear, cruelly blue, but there is no warmth in its light. Every breath you exhale becomes a cloud, and every step feels like a fight against a world that has suddenly turned hostile. Historians later measured the temperatures and noted that they dropped lower than anyone could have believed. In France, thermometers plunged to -20 degrees Celsius, and in parts of Germany and Scandinavia, it fell even further. But numbers only tell part of the story. What people felt, what they lived through, was something beyond numbers. It was a sense of being trapped in an endless, merciless night. The frost seeped into every part of daily life. Bread, when baked, turned as hard as stone in a matter of hours. Wine froze solid in its barrels. Even beer, often stored in thick, wooden casks, became slush. Men and women tried to chop food into pieces with axes, because knives simply snapped against the frozen crusts. Wells froze so deeply that villages had to break the ice with hammers just to draw water. For the wealthy, this was shocking enough. For the poor, it was catastrophic. Imagine a family in a wooden hut, their roof patched with straw, their clothes already thin and ragged from years of use. They huddle together under blankets that do little to stop the cold. Every log of wood, every scrap of coal, becomes a decision: burn it tonight to stay alive, or save it for tomorrow when the frost might be worse. Hunger already presses at their bellies, because food is spoiling faster than it can be eaten, and whatever is left in storage is turning into frozen lumps too hard to cook. In towns, the frost began to bend the normal flow of society. Merchants found their goods ruined. Bakers could no longer bake, millers could not grind grain, fishermen could not cast nets into frozen rivers. Markets stood empty, their stalls abandoned, their canopies sagging with icicles. Priests, in hushed voices, called it divine punishment. Politicians called it a natural disaster. Common people, their hands shaking and lips blue, called it what it was, a nightmare. And yet, through the fear, a strange determination began to grow. This was not the first hard winter Europe had faced, though it was by far the worst. People remembered stories from parents and grandparents about other freezes, about other lean years, about how families had survived by wit, by grit, and by sheer willpower. The frost of 1709, it seemed, was here to test them all. We know today that this great frost was the coldest winter Europe has ever recorded in its written history. But for those who lived it, there was no such label, no such certainty. All they knew was the pain in their bones, the hunger in their stomachs, and the gnawing fear that spring might never come. Every morning they woke to the same icy world. Every evening they went to bed wondering if they would live to see another dawn. And so begins our story, the story of the Great Frost of 1709. Over the chapters to come, we'll walk through frozen rivers and darkened homes. We'll see how kings in palaces and peasants in huts faced the same unrelenting cold. We'll learn how faith, ingenuity, and sheer endurance kept people alive, even as famine, sickness, and despair swept across the land. This is not just the tale of a season. It is the tale of survival, of humanity's quiet strength when the world itself seems determined to end. The frost did not simply chill the air, it conquered the land. Within days, Europe no longer resembled itself. Places once alive with movement and sound became silent, brittle landscapes, as if an unseen hand had carved the world into ice. Rivers, the arteries of Europe's trade and travel, were the first to surrender. The Seine in Paris hardened, its surface transforming into a sheet of glass so thick that people walked across it as though it were solid ground. The Thames in London froze from bank to bank, halting ships that once carried goods to the heart of the city. In Amsterdam, canals that had long been highways for merchants became crystalline roads where children skated and sleds replaced boats. To those who witnessed it, the sight was both wondrous and terrifying. What had once been water, alive, flowing, unpredictable, was now a silent, unbroken mirror, cold and unmoving. The sea itself joined in the transformation. Along stretches of the Dutch coast, the salt waves stiffened, trapping fishing boats mid-harbor. Sailors found their ships locked in ice, the masts rising above a frozen plain like ghostly markers. Nets and ropes snapped from the weight of frost. Harbors that had always bustled with activity fell eerily still. In the countryside, forests stood like armies of crystal. Trees bent under coats of ice, their branches glittering in weak sunlight but snapping with the sound of gunfire when the weight became too much. Birds that once filled the air with sound now lay frozen on the ground, their wings stiff and feathers frosted white. Deer, unable to graze, pressed closer to villages, thin and desperate. Even wolves, usually wary of humans, crept near towns, driven by hunger to prowl the frozen edges of civilization. Cities became kingdoms of silence. Streets that had once echoed with the clatter of carts and horses now rang only with the crunch of boots on snow. Icicles hung from every roof, some as long as spears. Windows frosted over so heavily that the sun's light barely penetrated the interiors of homes. Lantern flames flickered weakly against the cold, their glow swallowed by the vast whiteness outside. Even sound seemed to behave differently, muted, slowed, as though the frost had muffled the very air. Across the continent, life bent under this transformation. Windmills, the engines of Dutch agriculture, froze stiff and stood motionless, their sails heavy with frost. Watermills could not turn, their wheels locked in ice. Without them, grain could not be ground into flour, and bread became scarcer by the day. Vineyards lay ruined under layers of snow. Olive trees, unable to withstand the freeze, split and died, some never to recover. And yet, amid the devastation, people still found moments of wonder. In London, crowds gathered on the frozen Thames to marvel at the Frost Fair, where merchants set up tents and stalls directly on the ice. Bonfires were lit on the river itself, smoke curling upward into the icy sky. Children skated and played, their laughter cutting through the cold. Musicians played fiddles, jugglers performed tricks, and printers sold souvenirs marked printed on the Thames. For a brief time, survival mixed with spectacle. But underneath the merriment lay unease. People knew the fair would not last forever, and the same ice that brought amusement also brought hunger and death. The transformation was not merely physical, it was psychological. The landscape no longer behaved as people expected. Rivers were not rivers. Forests were not forests. The sea itself had betrayed them. For centuries, Europeans had built their lives around the cycles of nature, planting, harvesting, sailing, trading. The frost broke that rhythm. It turned the familiar into the alien. Imagine being a farmer in France, looking out at your land. Where once there had been fertile soil and ordered rows of vines, now there was nothing but snow and silence. Imagine being a fisherman in Italy, staring at the sea that had sustained your family for generations, only to see it stiff and unyielding, boat stuck like insects in amber. Imagine being a child, stepping into a world that seemed transformed overnight into something out of a fairy tale, but one written in hunger and cold rather than joy. The animals suffered as much as the people. Cattle, weakened by lack of fodder, collapsed in barns. Sheep froze in the fields. Horses struggled to pull carts over ice-slick roads. The link between human survival and animal endurance had never been clearer. When the beasts weakened, so too did their masters. Milk dried up, wool production stopped, and transportation faltered. But even as the frost claimed land, water, and life, people adapted in small, stubborn ways. Roads that became too icy for carts were crossed on foot, with sledges dragged by hand. Farmers chopped frozen roots from the ground to feed their animals, or fed them straw meant for bedding. Hunters, finding game scarce, turned to trapping smaller creatures, hares, rabbits, even birds, anything to fill a pot. Communities shared what they could, knowing that a neighbor's survival often meant their own. The frost did not discriminate. It wrapped itself around kingdoms and villages alike, making no distinction between the palace of a king and the hut of a peasant. The difference lay only in how much wood could be burned, how much food could be spared, and how much endurance a body could muster. Europe had become, in those days, a vast frozen kingdom. Its rivers, forests, fields, and seas were subjects under the rule of a merciless winter monarch. And the people, whether in Paris, Vienna, or Stockholm, were its unwilling citizens. They moved through this kingdom with care, knowing that every day of survival was borrowed time, every fire a fleeting victory against the cold. The frost had reshaped their world, and it was only the beginning. The true struggle was yet to come. Before the world turned white and silent, before the rivers froze and the forests cracked beneath the weight of ice, Europe in late 1708 and early 1709 still carried on as it always had. Life was not easy, wars rumbled across the continent, taxes pressed heavily on peasants, and food was never abundant for the poor, but the rhythm of the seasons remained steady and familiar. Imagine walking through a small village in France in the waning days of December. The fields lie quiet, resting after the autumn harvest. Stacks of hay and grain are stored in barns, enough, it is hoped, to carry families through the lean months until spring. Chickens peck near the frozen ground, pigs root in their pens, and cattle chew slowly on dried fodder. Families gather around hearth fires in the evenings, eating stews made from beans, bread, and whatever vegetables survived the winter storage. Markets in towns bustle even in the cold. Merchants arrive with carts of goods, salted fish, flour, firewood, woolen cloth. Shoppers barter and argue, children dart between stalls, and beggars hold out hands for coins. In places like Paris, the Seine still flows, its barges carrying wine, grain, and timber into the city. Bakers rise before dawn to prepare loaves for sale, their ovens filling narrow streets with warmth. In England, taverns glow with the light of candles, their wooden beams echoing with laughter and argument. Men talk of politics and the ongoing war of the Spanish succession, but also of crops and debts. In Germany and Austria, farmers prepare for Epiphany, the January celebration, with hopes that the new year might be kinder than the last. Churches ring bells, calling the faithful to prayer, their stone walls sheltering congregations from the ordinary winter chill. Even in colder corners of Europe, Poland, Sweden, Russia, people are accustomed to the bite of frost. They wear thick furs, burn wood in great stoves, and trust in traditions passed down through generations. For them, winter is always harsh, but never impossible. Food, though scarce, is still food. Root cellars hold cabbages, carrots, onions, and potatoes. Barrels of salted herring and pork stand ready for use. Grain is ground into flour, though the price of bread is always a source of tension. Wine cellars are stocked, ales are brewed, and butter, though precious, is available to those who can pay. Hunger is familiar, yes, but starvation, at least for now, is distant. Daily life follows its patterns. Children rise early to help with chores, fetching water from wells, tending goats, gathering firewood. Women spin wool or mend clothes while tending to the hearth. Men cut timber, repair tools, or prepare carts for trade. In noble houses, servants light fires in grand hearths, polish silver, and bring steaming cups of broth to their masters. Kings and queens dine on roasted meats, foreign fruits, and delicacies brought by merchants who travel across borders. Though there are gaps between rich and poor, each class believes it knows how to weather another winter. The rhythm of commerce continues, too. In Venice, ships unload spices and silk from the east. In Amsterdam, warehouses brim with goods from colonial trade, sugar, tobacco, coffee. In London, the hum of the exchange fills the air, as merchants speculate and haggle. These networks of trade are fragile, dependent on ships at sea and wagons on the roads, but for now they remain intact. And the land itself, though barren in the season, seems to rest in expectation of spring. Farmers, tired from autumn labor, use the winter months for repair and planning. They sit by fires and sharpen tools, mend harnesses, and talk quietly of planting time. There is always a sense of trust that no matter how bitter the snow, the soil will awaken again. This was the Europe that stood on the edge of January 1709. A continent not wealthy in comfort, but wealthy in rhythm. People had endured winters before. They had survived years of hunger and cold. The cycle of hardship and relief was old, almost eternal. Few could imagine it being broken. That is why the shock of the Great Frost was so profound. It did not strike a continent unprepared in general, it struck a continent that thought it understood what winter could be. People expected cold, they did not expect catastrophe. When the first signs arrived, water freezing too solid, bread hardening beyond use, livestock collapsing, there was disbelief. Surely this was only a passing storm. Surely the thaw would come soon. After all, it always had. But this time, it didn't. Looking back, the memory of life before the freeze feels almost like another world, one of noise and warmth compared to the silence that followed. The laughter in taverns, the cries of merchants at markets, the splash of rivers carrying barges, all of it was swept away, replaced by the grinding silence of ice. The contrast is what makes the story of the frost so haunting. Only by remembering the life that was lost, the normal rhythm of villages, towns, and cities, can we understand the despair that set in when that rhythm was shattered. Europe went from life to survival. From abundance, however modest, to famine. From warmth to cold so deep it silenced even hope. And it all began in a world that thought itself prepared, but was not. At first, no one wanted to believe it. Harsh winters were familiar enough, Europe had endured them before, and there was always suffering when the snows came. But what began in January 1709 felt different from the very first morning. In Paris, housewives carried buckets to the well only to find the water frozen so solid that metal pails cracked against the surface. Men lifted hammers and axes to break the ice, but the sound rang like striking stone. In Rome, the fountains, symbols of the city's endless flow, stiffened into monstrous sculptures of ice, the water arrested mid-splash. Across Germany, villagers woke to find doors frozen shut, snow piled waist-high, and roofs groaning under the crushing weight. Livestock were among the first casualties. In France, farmers opened their barns to discover cattle stiff and lifeless, their breath frozen in the air before them. Chickens froze on their perches, feathers turned brittle as glass. Horses collapsed on icy roads, their bodies steaming faintly before hardening into stillness. Without animals, not only food but transportation, ploughing, and trade would falter. Inside homes, the frost crept into every corner. Families tried to light fires, but logs hissed and spat as if the cold itself resisted the flame. Even when fires caught, their warmth seemed feeble, unable to push back against the chill. People pressed closer and closer to the hearth, wrapping themselves in furs, blankets, and straw. Children cried through the night, their breath rising like mist, their fingers purple with frostbite. Bread, the staple of European life, became the next disaster. Bakers who rose before dawn found their dough frozen in bowls, their ovens unable to keep pace with the cold. Loaves turned to stone within hours, so hard they could barely be cut with knives. Some families used axes to break bread into pieces small enough to chew. Wine froze in barrels, shattering the staves. Ale stiffened into slush. Butter turned to blocks, impossible to spread or melt without an hour's worth of firewood. The shock spread from households to entire communities. Markets stood eerily quiet. Merchants who tried to set up stalls discovered their goods ruined, vegetables blackened with frost, fruit split open and leaking frozen juices, fish stiff as wood. Coins stuck to bare fingers, and scales froze, unable to balance. Trade halted, not only because of ruined goods but because roads were impassable. Wagons overturned on ice. Couriers lost horses and froze in the snow. Communication between towns slowed to a trickle. In cities, the poor suffered most and earliest. Beggars who slept on church steps were found frozen in the morning, their bodies stiff as statues. Orphans huddled in doorways, teeth chattering until silence fell. Priests tried to bring the suffering inside, opening churches as shelters, but even stone walls and candlelight could not stop the creeping chill. Cathedrals echoed with coughs, prayers, and the muffled cries of families who had nowhere else to go. The wealthy, too, felt the shock, though in different ways. Nobles in Versailles discovered that the great fireplaces of their gilded halls could not warm the endless rooms. Servants hurried to hang thick curtains across doorways, to seal cracks with cloth, to keep in whatever heat they could. Kings and queens, who dined on feasts just weeks before, now watched their wines freeze and their kitchens struggle. In the great courts of Europe, luxury gave no immunity from the frost. Travelers told stories that deepened the sense of dread. Along the frozen Rhine, entire barges lay trapped, their crews forced to abandon ship. On the Baltic, fishermen smashed holes through ice only to find the sea frozen deep, their nets useless. In England, tales spread of birds dropping from the sky mid-flight, their wings coated with frost. People whispered of wolves prowling closer, their howls echoing across snowfields at night. And still, the temperature dropped lower. The shock was no longer just about inconvenience, it was about survival. Parents feared sending children outside. Farmers wept at the sight of withered crops that had never even risen from the earth. Woodpiles dwindled alarmingly fast, every log a small piece of borrowed time. In desperation, families began burning furniture, tools, even the beams of their own homes to keep the fire alive for one more night. Fear gave way to superstition. Was this God's punishment? Was it a warning, a curse, or the end of days? Priests preached repentance, urging towns to gather for processions and prayers. Bells rang out across frozen villages, their sound sharp and hollow in the brittle air. But no prayers thawed the rivers, and no candle staved off the icy grip. In the silence of the nights, when winds howled across rooftops and shutters rattled like drums, people understood the truth. This was no passing storm. This was no ordinary frost. This was something new, something merciless, something that could not be measured in days or weeks. This was a test of life itself. The first shock was not just the cold in the air. It was the realization that the world they knew, the rhythms of food, fire, trade, and comfort, had been broken in an instant. Each day that passed would demand more than the last. And many would not survive to see the thaw. If the outside world had been conquered by frost, the inside world soon followed. Homes, whether huts of peasants, cottages of tradesmen, or the halls of nobility, offered little protection against a winter that seemed intent on breaching every barrier. By the second week of January 1709, countless dwellings across Europe no longer felt like shelters. They felt like tombs of ice. For the poor, the struggle was immediate and merciless. Their homes were simple, walls of timber or stone, roofs patched with thatch, cracks stuffed with straw or cloth to keep out the ordinary chill. But in this frost, those measures failed. The cold slipped through the smallest gap, crept through shutters, and froze moisture on the walls. Frost bloomed like white flowers on wooden beams. Windows glazed from the inside, sealing rooms in sheets of ice. By morning, water left by the hearth froze solid, so that even inside their homes, families awoke to the sting of winter air. Nights were the worst. When fires burned low, the temperature inside cottages dropped so steeply that people feared sleeping alone. Families began to huddle together in one room, often in one bed, piling straw and blankets over their bodies. Parents clutched their children close, not only for love but for warmth. Breathing together kept a trace of heat alive, a fragile defense against a darkness that seemed endless. Fuel became as precious as food. Every log thrown into the fire was measured, debated, and mourned. Families faced cruel choices: burn the last cartwheel for warmth, or save it for spring planting. Burn the bed frame, or endure the night and hope the cold did not claim them. Many chose to sacrifice what they owned piece by piece. Chairs, tables, cupboards, all were fed to the flames. Even doors were taken from their hinges, chopped apart to keep the hearth burning. In wealthier homes, survival looked different but carried its own desperation. Stone manor houses and palaces held fireplaces in every room, yet their vast chambers swallowed heat as fast as servants could deliver wood. Curtains were hung across corridors to keep warmth trapped in smaller spaces. Beds were draped with thick tapestries, transformed into enclosed chambers where nobles lay bundled in fur, their breath clouding the air inside. Still, many discovered that luxury could not stop the frost. Silver goblets split in half when wine inside froze. Pipes burst, flooding floors with ice. Even the grand halls of Versailles became silent and frigid, their glittering mirrors dimmed by frost. The frost did not merely attack comfort, it attacked the very structure of the home. Roofs collapsed under heavy snow. Beams cracked as moisture froze inside them. Wells dug beneath houses stiffened until no water could be drawn. In towns, chimneys clogged with ice, smoke backing into rooms until families suffocated from the fumes of their own fires. Survival demanded constant vigilance, tending the fire, patching holes, shoveling snow, breaking ice again and again. Yet people found ways to endure. Peasants stuffed straw into their clothes, creating makeshift insulation. Women wrapped their children in rags dipped in animal fat, hoping the grease would block the wind. Some families slept in barns with their animals, sharing warmth with cattle, pigs, or goats. In those nights, survival blurred the line between man and beast. It did not matter where the heat came from, only that it was enough to see another sunrise. In towns and cities, entire neighborhoods began to change. Fires burned constantly, filling the air with smoke, but still houses froze. Neighbors often gathered in the largest dwelling, crowding together in rooms that smelled of sweat, smoke, and fear. Churches became refuges too, their high stone walls echoing with whispered prayers as families lit candles by the dozens, the flames casting a trembling glow that pushed back against the dark. But even in those gathering places, the frost crept in. Worshippers could see their breath rising like smoke during Mass. Priests shivered at the altar. Wooden pews cracked and splintered. Candles froze in their holders, flames struggling to melt their own wax. People sat shoulder to shoulder, eyes closed, not just in devotion but in the desperate hope that together, their bodies could generate warmth enough to survive the service. For the sick and elderly, homes became prisons. Without strength to chop wood or fetch water, many lay in their beds until the cold overtook them. Families tried to keep loved ones alive by piling blankets high, but blankets grew stiff with frost. Bread crumbled to powder when warmed too quickly, and broth cooled to ice before it reached their lips. When death came, it was often quiet, so quiet that in the morning, others in the same bed awoke to find one body no longer breathing. And yet, amid the despair, resilience showed itself. Families sang songs in the long nights, their voices soft and trembling but defiant against silence. Mothers told stories to children beneath the blankets, weaving tales of warmer days and brighter futures. Fathers taught sons how to build stoves from clay, how to feed fires with dried moss, how to stretch one log into a night of heat. Neighbors shared what they had: an extra quilt, a half-burned candle, a pot of thin soup. The frost had turned homes into ice caves, but the people inside refused to let those caves become graves. Every night endured was a victory. Every morning smoke rising from chimneys was proof that the cold, however merciless, had not won. The battle for survival was only beginning. Beyond the frozen walls of homes, another enemy was growing: hunger. And hunger, unlike cold, could not be fought with blankets and fire. It demanded food that no field could give, no market could provide. The first weeks of the frost tested people's strength against the cold. But as days stretched into weeks, another enemy emerged, one far slower, but just as merciless: hunger. At first, most families believed they had enough. The autumn harvest of 1708 had been gathered before the frost struck, and barns, cellars, and pantries across Europe held their usual winter stores. Barrels of salted fish, pork, and beef, sacks of grain and beans, casks of wine and ale, dried fruits and roots pulled from the soil, these were the reserves meant to carry households through until spring. But the great frost was no ordinary winter. It devoured supplies as swiftly as it devoured warmth. Bread, once the foundation of daily meals, became the first to vanish. Grain prices soared as mills froze and supply lines broke. In France, the cost of a single loaf tripled within weeks. Bakers, unable to grind flour or fire ovens properly, produced fewer loaves, and those they did bake froze solid within hours. Poor families, already living on thin margins, could no longer afford even the smallest piece. Mothers tore crusts into tiny fragments, giving each child a morsel and going hungry themselves. Vegetables, stored in cellars, withered into black husks under the frost. Carrots, cabbages, and onions rotted or froze so solid they split apart when struck. Potatoes, not yet as common in Europe as they would later become, spoiled quickly, turning to mush. What little remained edible was hoarded carefully, stretched into thin soups that gave more warmth than nourishment. Meat fared no better. Livestock had already begun to die in barns and fields, their bodies too weak to endure the cold. Farmers slaughtered what animals they could, salting or smoking the meat in desperation, but even preserved meat froze so hard it could not be cooked without hours of firewood. Families gnawed on frozen bones, boiled them again and again for broth so thin it was little more than colored water. Markets grew emptier by the day. Where once merchants shouted prices and bartered with customers, silence now hung heavy. Stalls stood abandoned, their canopies sagging under icicles. Those who still had food to sell demanded outrageous sums. Black markets sprang up in alleyways, where desperate men and women traded rings, clothes, or tools for scraps of bread or handfuls of beans. In some towns, the price of a single egg rose higher than a day's wages. And yet, the hunger was not only about food, it was about the knowledge that no new supplies would come. The fields were frozen, the vines dead, the olive groves shattered. Even if the frost ended tomorrow, the damage to crops meant famine would linger long after. Farmers stared at their frozen land and wept, knowing that nothing would grow in the spring. Villagers whispered that the true horror had not yet begun, that the real suffering would arrive when the frost retreated, leaving barren soil behind. For now, survival meant improvisation. Families scraped the last grains from barrels, swept crumbs from cupboards, boiled leather straps to soften them into chewable strips. In Germany, people ground acorns into bitter flour. In Sweden, they mixed sawdust with meal to stretch bread. In Poland, families ate bark stripped from trees. These desperate measures filled bellies for a time, but offered no real nourishment. Bodies weakened, sickness spread, and hunger became constant. Children felt it first. Their faces grew hollow, their cries weaker. Mothers tried to soothe them with lullabies, but no song could fill an empty stomach. Infants who could no longer nurse faded quietly in their mother's arms. The elderly, too, were among the first to go, their bodies unable to endure both cold and hunger. Families sometimes faced unthinkable choices, saving food for the young, while elders sacrificed their portions for another generation's survival. Even the wealthy, though better supplied, could not escape the shadow of famine. Their granaries and cellars gave them time, yes, but the frost stretched on and on. What good was gold when bread could not be bought? Nobles found themselves bargaining with peasants for grain, their jewels exchanged for simple food. In palaces, great feasts shrank into meager meals. Kitchens struggled to prepare dishes that once symbolized abundance. Hunger, though dulled by luxury, still gnawed at every table. Travelers carried tales of famine from one land to another. In France, starving peasants stormed grain stores, only to find them already empty. In Italy, fishermen returned with empty nets, the seas too cold and lifeless to yield. In Switzerland, mountain villages ran out of supplies altogether, their paths blocked by avalanches and snow too deep to cross. In every story, the pattern was the same: food was gone, and more would not come. Hunger did more than weaken bodies, it strained the bonds of community. Neighbors who once shared bread now eyed each other with suspicion. Theft rose. Grain merchants were attacked. Families locked their doors, guarding their last crusts of bread as if they were treasure. Riots broke out in towns, fueled not by anger alone but by empty stomachs. Soldiers tried to restore order, but even they demanded food for payment. Authority itself began to falter, and famine blurred the line between survival and lawlessness. Yet in the midst of it all, moments of humanity remained. Some priests opened church stores, giving away what little grain they had to the poor. Wealthy families, faced with growing unrest, distributed food in carefully rationed portions. Neighbors sometimes returned to sharing, realizing that hoarding alone meant only dying alone. Hunger had hollowed Europe, but it had not erased compassion entirely. Still, the horizon looked bleak. The frost showed no sign of breaking, and with each passing week, more bellies ached, more bodies weakened. The cold could be endured for a time, with fire and blankets. But hunger was endless, gnawing, merciless. It consumed the living from within, leaving them shadows of themselves. And so the people of Europe entered the next stage of their ordeal. No longer was survival only about warmth. Now it was about finding food in a world where food no longer grew, no longer moved, no longer existed in any abundance. Famine had arrived, and it would stay long after the frost was gone. When the frost dragged on past the first weeks, when fires grew smaller and cupboards emptier, people turned to the only force they believed might hold power over such suffering: God. Europe in 1709 was a deeply religious continent. The church was not simply a place of worship, it was the rhythm of life, the keeper of law, the voice of authority. When disaster struck, people instinctively sought meaning in the divine. And so, as the frost tightened its grip, prayers rose like smoke from frozen villages and silent cities. Church bells rang constantly, their sound carrying over snowy fields, sharp in the cold air. In France, priests led processions through the streets, parishioners following with candles clutched tightly in gloved hands. They sang hymns, their voices trembling not only from devotion but from the shivers of the cold. Some walked barefoot in the snow as a sign of penance, believing that personal sacrifice might persuade heaven to relent. In Italy, monasteries opened their doors to the hungry and the homeless. Monks shared thin bowls of soup, blessing each spoonful before it was handed out. Chapels became gathering places, not just for prayer but for survival, their stone walls echoing with both psalms and coughs. Statues of saints were carried through frozen streets, their faces covered in frost, as though heaven itself had been caught in the storm. But with faith came fear. Priests in pulpits declared the frost a punishment for sin. In some towns, villagers were told the cold was a judgment upon greed, lust, or disobedience. Repentance was demanded. Fasts were declared, ironically starving people further in the hope of earning divine mercy. In Germany, some whispered that the frost was the devil's work, a sign of Satan stalking the land. In Poland and Russia, rumors spread of witches calling down the cold, their curses freezing the soil and sky. Superstition flourished where reason failed. Farmers lit bonfires in fields, believing the smoke might drive the frost away. Families hung charms above doors, branches of holly, scraps of blessed cloth, even animal bones, anything thought to repel evil. Children were warned to stay silent at night, lest their cries invite spirits of the cold into the house. Some villagers swore they had seen figures moving in the snow at dusk, pale shapes that vanished when approached. Fear turned natural shadows into omens. For rulers, too, religion became both shield and weapon. Louis XIV of France ordered days of prayer across his kingdom, summoning his people to beg for divine relief. In Vienna, Emperor Joseph I did the same, calling on priests to hold vigils that lasted through the night. Across courts and palaces, rulers tried to show themselves not as kings above their people, but as fellow petitioners before God. Yet privately, even they feared. For if the frost was truly a punishment, what sins of kings had brought it down? Faith could not melt the ice, but it offered something else, a way to endure. In villages where food was gone and fires weak, prayers gave people words when no solutions remained. When mothers could not feed their children, they sang hymns to them, rocking them with verses as old as memory. When men buried loved ones in frozen ground, priests spoke blessings over the graves, words of hope even when hope seemed absurd. But faith also divided. In some towns, when famine grew worse, people accused neighbors of hidden sins, blaming them for angering heaven. Witches were suspected. Outsiders, strangers passing through, beggars with no homes, were shunned or attacked, believed to carry curses in their footsteps. Fear warped faith into suspicion, and suspicion into violence. Still, the church remained the heart of resistance for many. Candles flickered against frost-covered walls, their light steady even as everything else failed. Monks copied down records of the frost, writing of the cold in neat Latin script, ensuring that memory would outlive suffering. Bishops preached endurance, declaring that every winter must yield to spring, just as every trial must yield to salvation. And in the silence of long nights, when winds howled against shutters and families huddled together, people prayed not for wealth, nor for glory, nor for kingdoms, but simply for dawn. For one more sunrise. For one more day to survive. The great frost had stripped away illusions of control. Nature was beyond command, beyond kings and courts, beyond the reach of armies. All that remained was faith, fragile and powerful, filling the void where warmth and food had been. And so Europe endured, not just with fire and scraps of bread, but with whispered prayers in the dark, with fear of punishment and hope of mercy. Faith became both a burden and a lifeline. And though the frost did not answer, the people kept praying, because prayer was the only flame that could not be extinguished. The frost showed no mercy, not even to kings. For all the power of monarchs, for all the splendor of palaces and the treasures of nobility, the great frost of 1709 seeped through walls of gold as easily as it did through cottages of straw. In France, Louis XIV, the Sun King, ruler of Versailles, faced a kingdom in crisis. The glittering palace, with its endless galleries and gardens, had been designed to display magnificence, not to withstand nature's cruelty. Drafts whistled through grand halls. Fireplaces roared day and night, consuming mountains of firewood, but the cold still found its way into chambers where courtiers shivered beneath layers of velvet and fur. Servants hung heavy curtains across windows and doorways, trying to trap warmth inside smaller spaces. Even so, frost formed on the glass, spreading delicate patterns like lace, reminders that the outside world pressed in relentlessly. In the royal kitchens, chefs struggled. Food spoiled quickly. Wine froze in the cellars, splitting barrels apart. Exotic fruits, once shipped from abroad to grace royal tables, withered in the frost. Even meat roasted over flames cooled to ice before it reached the king's plate. The luxury of Versailles was still dazzling to behold, but within its splendor ran an undertone of desperation. Behind the velvet drapes and chandeliers, courtiers huddled close to fires, whispering of famine and unrest beyond the gates. Louis XIV knew his people were suffering. Reports arrived daily from across France, peasants starving, riots in towns, grain prices soaring. The king ordered prayers across the kingdom, declaring the frost a test sent from God. He tried to appear as a father to his people, a sovereign who suffered with them. But no royal decree could warm a frozen field or bring back the dead livestock. The frost ignored crowns as easily as it ignored cottages. Elsewhere in Europe, other rulers faced the same trial. In Vienna, Emperor Joseph I held court in palaces that were grand but draughty, their stone walls offering little comfort against the bitter air. Fires blazed in every room, yet courtiers complained that their breath still hung in clouds as they spoke. The emperor ordered relief for the poor, but even imperial stores of grain dwindled quickly. Nobility accustomed to feasts now picked carefully at smaller portions, a quiet humiliation that echoed the desperation of their subjects. In England, Queen and court felt the frost too. The Thames, frozen solid, carried news of suffering throughout London. Though the Queen sat on a throne in warm chambers, she could not ignore the sight of her people gathering in churches, desperate for food and fuel. Members of Parliament debated relief measures, but the frost silenced trade and emptied coffers. Even the mighty machinery of government seemed powerless against the weather. Nobles across Europe found themselves humbled. Their wealth could buy food for a time, but as markets collapsed and roads froze, gold and silver became meaningless. What use was a jewel when bread was worth more? What good was a carriage when horses lay dead in their stalls? Nobility, long removed from the struggles of peasants, discovered that the frost was a great leveler. Hunger gnawed at the edges of every banquet. Fear crept into every firelit hall. Yet the frost also exposed the distance between rich and poor. While peasants froze in barns and burned furniture to survive, nobles still sat in heated chambers draped in furs. While common families shared scraps of bread, noble households ate preserved meats and imported delicacies, however diminished. Resentment grew. Peasants whispered that kings feasted while children starved, and though the frost did not begin a revolution, it planted seeds of bitterness that would not be forgotten. The frost also altered politics. Armies, already weary from the War of the Spanish Succession, froze in their camps. Supply lines collapsed. Soldiers deserted in search of food. Kings who relied on military power found their forces as helpless as their subjects. Diplomats wrote letters with stiff fingers, ink freezing in their wells, while treaties stalled under the weight of hunger and despair. The frost, without lifting a sword, had managed to halt wars more effectively than any general. Still, even in palaces, resilience shone. Courtiers found new ways to endure, layering clothing, hosting smaller gatherings in warmer chambers, even skating on frozen ponds within palace grounds. In Russia, where winters were always harsh, nobles wore heavy furs and carried on as best they could, their endurance shaped by generations of cold. But even there, the frost of 1709 was extraordinary, stronger than memory or tradition. What united kings and peasants alike was the realization that they were powerless before nature. Thrones, armies, wealth, all bent beneath the weight of the frost. And yet, rulers tried to preserve order. They issued decrees to ration grain, to distribute fuel, to keep peace in markets. Some succeeded, others failed, but all shared in the knowledge that survival required more than power. It required endurance. In time, chronicles would record the suffering of peasants in greater detail than the discomfort of kings. But the frost had touched them all. In Versailles, in Vienna, in London, in Moscow, nobility shivered in silence, realizing that crowns offered no protection from a frozen world. The frost had become the true monarch of Europe, a ruler whose domain stretched from farm to palace, whose decree was death and endurance. Kings could only bow their heads and wait for spring. Rivers had always been lifelines. They carried grain, wine, timber, and salt. They linked villages to towns, towns to cities, and kingdoms to one another. The Seine in France, the Thames in England, the canals of the Dutch Republic, all were arteries through which Europe's lifeblood flowed. But in the winter of 1709, those arteries froze. And with them, life itself seemed to stop. In Paris, the Seine stiffened until barges sat trapped in their berths, caught as though by an invisible hand. Men climbed down to the ice, striking it with poles, but the frozen surface did not break. It groaned under their blows, mocking their efforts. Soon, instead of trying to free their vessels, Parisians began to cross the river on foot. Families walked across the same waters that had carried ships for centuries, marveling at the strange solidity beneath their feet. Yet what seemed at first a wonder quickly became a curse. Without barges, food and firewood could not move. The veins of the city had been cut. In London, the Thames turned to a highway of frost. The river, always busy with boats and ferries, became a plain of ice stretching from shore to shore. At first, people hesitated to trust it, but soon bold souls ventured out, their boots crunching on the glassy surface. Tent by tent, stall by stall, a fair began to rise on the river itself. It was called the Frost Fair. Merchants erected wooden booths where once boats had floated, selling meat pies, gingerbread, and ale. Bonfires roared on the ice, their smoke curling upward while sparks hissed against the frozen ground. Children skated, laughing, while jugglers and fiddlers entertained crowds. Printers set up presses and sold sheets stamped with the words, "Printed on the Thames, in the year of our Lord 1709. The fair was both joy and denial. It gave people a moment of escape, a chance to turn disaster into celebration. But beneath the laughter, hunger gnawed. Behind the games and music, families still froze in their homes. The fair was not a cure, it was a distraction. And when cracks appeared in the ice, sharp and sudden, the crowd scattered in fear, reminded that their stage of merriment was also a grave waiting to open. Elsewhere, rivers froze without festivity. In Germany, the Rhine hardened, cutting trade routes in half. Barges loaded with grain and coal sat locked, their crews abandoning them to seek food ashore. Along the Dutch canals, fishermen cursed as nets tangled in ice, their livelihoods vanished overnight. In Poland, rivers froze so thickly that wagons rolled across them as if they were roads. What seemed at first a miracle of convenience, a shortcut across the water, soon revealed itself as a sign of despair, for the frozen rivers carried nothing but silence. Nature itself seemed frozen in place. Waterfalls stiffened into sculpted columns of ice. Springs stopped bubbling. Wells froze so deeply that villagers could no longer draw water, forcing them to melt snow for drinking. The rivers, once full of motion and noise, became still mirrors, reflecting a sky too clear, too cruel. Travelers spoke of walking for hours along ice, hearing only the distant cracks beneath their feet, each step a reminder of how fragile survival had become. Animals, too, suffered. Fish, trapped beneath ice, died in the thousands, their bodies floating lifeless when the thaw finally came. Birds, deprived of open water, starved or froze. The absence of their cries made rivers eerier still, no gulls over the Seine, no ducks on the Thames, no songbirds along the banks. What had once been living corridors were now corridors of death. For cities like Paris and London, the frozen rivers were more than curiosities, they were catastrophes. Paris relied on barges along the Seine to bring wood from the forests, grain from the countryside, and goods from beyond. When the river froze, supply collapsed. Firewood prices doubled, then tripled. Grain became rarer. Hunger deepened, and cold thickened. In London, the Thames ice cut off ferries, forcing people to cross on foot, sometimes dangerously, sometimes fatally when the ice gave way. The Frost Fair was a spectacle, yes, but it was also a reminder that even the great city of London could be brought to its knees by a frozen river. Still, people could not help but marvel at the beauty of it all. Lanterns glowed on the ice at night, their light reflecting across smooth, endless surfaces. Icicles dripped from bridges like crystal daggers. The rivers, usually brown and churning, shone under the pale sun as white, glittering plains. For some, it felt like living inside a painting. For others, it felt like living inside a coffin. The rivers were symbols, as much as realities. They showed how deeply the frost had reached into the bones of Europe. When rivers froze, it meant more than cold water. It meant paralyzed trade, silent markets, empty bellies. It meant that even the natural rhythms of life, currents, tides, seasons, had been broken. And so the Seine, the Thames, the Rhine, the Vistula, and countless lesser rivers became frozen highways of despair. They carried no ships, no food, no warmth. Only footsteps, only echoes, only the heavy weight of silence. The people of Europe learned then what it meant for life itself to stop flowing. And they began to wonder if spring would ever come. Markets had always been the heartbeat of Europe's towns and cities. On market days, streets filled with noise and color, farmers shouting prices for their vegetables, butchers displaying cuts of fresh meat, bakers selling steaming loaves, and merchants trading spices, cloth, or timber. In winter, the crowds might thin, but the stalls always opened. Commerce was the rhythm that kept life moving. But during the Great Frost of 1709, that rhythm faltered, and then it died. The first sign was silence. In Paris, the busy stalls along the Pont Neuf stood empty. Merchants arrived only to find their goods ruined, vegetables blackened and split, fruits frozen solid, barrels of fish stiff as boards. Those who tried to sell found no buyers, for people had no coins to spare and no faith that what they bought would last. A loaf of bread, once cheap enough for the poor, became a luxury beyond reach. In London, the markets near Cheapside and Covent Garden saw the same fate. Apples cracked under the frost. Eggs froze and burst in their shells. Milk stiffened in pails. The few goods that survived the cold were guarded jealously, their prices doubled or tripled overnight. Buyers haggled with desperation in their voices, but sellers held firm. They too were hungry, they too had families to feed, and every coin mattered. The collapse of trade reached beyond food. Blacksmiths found that iron froze brittle in their workshops, making tools and horseshoes harder to produce. Tanners saw hide stiffen into boards, impossible to work. Cloth merchants sold fewer garments, for people spent their last coins on bread rather than new coats. Shoemakers sat idle, their wares too expensive for villagers whose only concern was finding the next meal. The entire chain of commerce unraveled, one link at a time. Fuel became its own form of currency. Firewood, once traded in abundance, grew scarce. Wagons could not cross frozen roads, and barges could not move on icy rivers. What little would reach the city sold for sums that once might have bought a fine cloak. People bartered rings, candlesticks, and even heirlooms for a bundle of logs. Charcoal sellers, too, raised their prices, though supplies dwindled quickly. The poor, unable to buy fuel, turned instead to scavenging. Whole forests near towns were stripped bare of branches. Fences disappeared overnight, stolen for firewood. Even coffins, freshly buried, were rumored to be dug up, not for their contents, but for the wood that might mean warmth. Desperation reshaped markets into shadows of themselves. Where once dozens of stalls had stood, now only a handful remained, guarded fiercely by merchants who feared theft. Black markets flourished in alleys and taverns, where food was traded in whispers. A loaf of bread might cost a week's wages. A sack of flour could be exchanged for a silver brooch or a bolt of cloth. Trust vanished. Buyers feared being cheated, sellers feared being robbed. Riots became common. In France, starving crowds stormed bakeries and warehouses, demanding grain. Soldiers were called to restore order, but even soldiers needed food. In some towns, they joined the rioters rather than opposing them. In Italy, markets were scenes of constant arguments, with families begging for mercy and merchants insisting they could not give what they did not have. In the Dutch Republic, once proud of its wealth and trade, merchants stared helplessly at frozen canals that cut them off from the world. Ships sat silent, cargo trapped far away, while hunger crept closer each day. The collapse of trade struck not only individuals but entire economies. Governments saw tax revenues plummet as commerce slowed. Armies, reliant on steady supplies, found themselves weakened by hunger. Diplomats in foreign courts wrote of despair, sending letters stained with frost, reporting shortages that no policy could mend. The frost was not simply a natural disaster, it was an economic catastrophe that rippled through every level of society. And yet, amid the ruin, small sparks of resilience appeared. Some merchants, unwilling to see neighbors starve, gave away food for free. A baker in Paris was said to have opened his ovens at night to cook what flour remained, handing loaves to orphans without charge. Priests used church stores to feed the poorest, though supplies were always limited. Neighbors shared scraps, bartered honestly, and created informal systems of exchange. A blanket for a loaf. A bundle of straw for a pot of broth. Human ingenuity tried to soften the sharpest edges of collapse. But these moments could not change the larger truth: the frost had shattered commerce. Markets that once thrived with the sounds of bargaining and laughter now echoed with silence. Stalls stood empty, their wooden frames covered in snow. Coins grew useless in pockets that could not find bread to buy. For centuries, people had believed that trade was the lifeline of survival. But the Great Frost revealed something deeper, that without warmth, without harvest, without nature itself, no amount of coins or contracts could save them. Markets could only exist if there was food to sell, fuel to burn, and goods to move. In 1709, those things had vanished, and with them, the heartbeat of daily life. By February, in town after town, the story was the same. Empty stalls. Silent streets. Hungry eyes searching for food that no merchant could provide. The frost had claimed not just homes and fields, but the very heart of European society, its trade. And without trade, hunger and despair spread further still. By February of 1709, the frost no longer seemed like a passing ordeal. It had become a reaper, moving silently through towns and villages, leaving bodies in its wake. At first, death came quietly, almost unnoticed, a beggar found frozen on church steps, a farmer's ox stiff in its stall, a child too weak to wake in the morning. But soon, the trickle of lives lost became a flood. Death was no longer the exception. It was everywhere. In the countryside, families faced a grim arithmetic. With barns empty and fields dead, meals grew smaller each day. Parents starved themselves to feed their children only to collapse from weakness. Infants faded in their mothers' arms, their cries dwindling to silence. Elders, their bodies already frail, often volunteered to go without, whispering to their families to save food for the young. In many homes, the first to die were the oldest, the last gifts they could give being their own survival sacrificed. Frostbite claimed countless others. Fingers, toes, and noses blackened in the cold, infection spreading quickly in weakened bodies. Villagers huddled together at night, only to find by morning that one among them had gone stiff in the dark. Entire families were discovered lifeless in their cottages, huddled in beds where they had clung to one another for warmth until the very end. Cities fared no better. In Paris, corpses piled along streets when cemeteries could not keep pace with the burials. The ground was too hard to dig, forcing families to wait days before they could lay their loved ones to rest. Churches became not only places of prayer but of storage, pews filled with shrouded figures awaiting burial. In London, parish records swelled with names, entire households lost within weeks. The Thames, frozen and silent, bore witness to a city that buried its dead faster than it baptized its young. Markets, already empty of food, grew heavy with grief. Where once stalls had displayed fruits and bread, now rumors spread of bodies being carted away before dawn to avoid frightening the crowds. Neighbors whispered of houses where no smoke rose from chimneys, a sure sign that death had visited inside. Priests moved from home to home, blessing the dying, consoling the living, and offering words that sometimes felt too small against the enormity of loss. Animals died in equal numbers. Horses fell in the roads, their carcasses stiffening where they collapsed. Sheep, once blankets of wool in the fields, froze into motionless mounds. Dogs and cats, so often companions to families, became either victims of the cold or, in the most desperate cases, food. The bond between human and beast blurred under the weight of survival. Travelers wrote of horror across the continent. In Switzerland, entire mountain villages disappeared under avalanches of ice and snow, their people entombed without rescue. In Poland, peasants were found along roadsides, their belongings scattered, their faces twisted in frozen agony. In Germany, rivers yielded corpses when ice shifted, bodies preserved in the clear water below. No region was spared. The Great Frost did not discriminate. And yet, the toll was more than physical. The constant presence of death seeped into minds and spirits. Children grew silent, their laughter replaced by wide, fearful eyes. Songs disappeared from taverns. Weddings, usually a beacon of life in dark times, dwindled to near nothing. Despair became as deadly as cold and hunger. Some gave up entirely, lying down beside their fires and refusing to rise again, convinced that spring would never return. Even the wealthy, though shielded by their stores and servants, could not escape death. Nobles fell ill in their draughty palaces. Court records note lords and ladies succumbing to fevers, their weakened bodies unable to resist. Kings themselves mourned courtiers and advisers. The frost was a great equalizer, sweeping from peasants' huts to gilded halls. And still, communities endured the grim work of burying their dead. Men hacked at frozen ground with picks, their blows ringing like iron on stone. Graves were shallow, often shared, bodies laid together because the earth refused to yield more. Families carved simple wooden crosses, sometimes without names, because there was no time or strength for more. Priests recited prayers over mounds of snow that covered graves too hastily dug. In many places, survivors began to see the frost not just as a disaster, but as an enemy. They spoke of it as if it were alive, a living thing that crept into homes, claimed their neighbors, and lingered where warmth had once been. Death was its shadow, stalking them all, reminding them that no fire, no wealth, no prayer could fully guarantee survival. Yet amid the mourning, humanity still flickered. Neighbors carried bodies for those too weak to do it themselves. Priests held funerals long after nightfall, their candles glowing in the dark. Mothers whispered lullabies to the dying, not to soothe sleep, but to soften death's approach. Acts of kindness continued, even when kindness seemed too costly to give. The great frost left scars not only on the land, but on memory. Generations would later recall the winter when the bells tolled without ceasing, when the streets were lined with black shrouds, when every family seemed to lose someone they loved. It was a season when death was not hidden, but visible everywhere, in fields, in towns, in the silence of homes that would never again hear the voices of those lost. For those who lived through it, the frost became a story not only of survival, but of mourning. To survive was to carry the weight of those who had not. And by the time the frost loosened its grip, Europe was not only hungry and cold. It was grieving. If hunger gnawed slowly at the body, cold attacked it instantly. Survival during the Great Frost of 1709 was not only about finding food, it was about clinging to warmth in a world determined to strip it away. For peasants, the struggle began inside their cottages. Fires burned day and night, but no matter how fiercely the flames roared, they seemed too small against the endless tide of cold. Families learned to seal themselves into a single room, abandoning the rest of the house. Windows were covered with rags or wooden shutters. Cracks in walls were stuffed with straw, moss, or even mud, anything to block the draft. People slept in their clothes, layer upon layer of wool, linen, and fur, until movement itself became stiff. At night, families pressed together on straw beds, huddling so close that they could feel one another's heartbeat through the dark. Some households resorted to burning anything that could catch flame. Furniture, cart wheels, broken tools, all were chopped apart for the hearth. In desperate moments, even books were fed to the fire, pages curling into ash. What was once precious became fuel. A wooden spoon, a fence post, even a cradle, everything was weighed against the choice between sentiment and survival. Ingenuity appeared in strange forms. In France, families lined their clothes with straw, creating makeshift insulation. In Germany, peasants rubbed their skin with animal fat before stepping outside, the grease forming a thin barrier against the wind. In Sweden, people built sleeping pits in the ground, lining them with straw and animal hides, using the earth's own insulation to shield them from the worst of the air above. Animals often became sources of warmth as well as food. Families shared barns with cows, goats, or pigs, their breath and bodies turning the space into a crude but life-saving shelter. Children slept nestled against dogs, their fur a comfort as much as a blanket. In villages, neighbors sometimes crowded into the largest barn together, dozens of people and animals forming a single living furnace against the frost. In cities, the struggle looked different but no less desperate. Chimneys smoked constantly, filling the air with a haze that mixed with fog. But even there, warmth was uneven. Wealthier families burned coal and wood without restraint, while the poor scavenged scraps. Broken barrels became firewood. Stray planks from abandoned buildings vanished overnight. In Paris, the price of firewood soared so high that many could afford only a handful of logs a week. People learned to stretch fires by banking them with ashes, keeping embers alive until morning, when they could be coaxed back to flame. Some turned to clever inventions. Metal braziers, filled with coals, were carried from room to room, though they filled homes with choking smoke. Bed warmers, Pans filled with embers were slid beneath blankets before sleep, their heat fading quickly but offering a brief reprieve. Wealthy households draped their beds in heavy curtains, trapping body heat inside what became small chambers of survival. But no matter the tricks, the frost found its way in. Water in cups froze overnight, even beside the fire. Wash basins stiffened into ice. Bread left too close to the window hardened into stone. The air inside homes often felt as sharp as the air outside. Survival was not about comfort, it was about endurance. The cold also reshaped daily life. Farmers could not plow, merchants could not haul, and craftsmen could not work with frozen materials. But every task became centered on warmth. Children were sent to gather sticks. Men cut down trees wherever they could, even in forbidden royal forests, risking punishment for the chance to keep their families alive. Women tended fires like guardians, their entire day consumed with coaxing sparks, feeding logs, and watching embers. Even rulers felt the weight of the struggle. In Versailles, the great halls echoed with the sound of logs being dragged, day and night. Servants hauled wood constantly, yet the palace still shivered with drafts. Courtiers wrapped themselves in cloaks during meals, their breath visible in the candlelight. In London, coal burned in Parliament, but lawmakers shivered nonetheless, their ink freezing in wells as they tried to write decrees. In Vienna, the emperor's palace smelled of constant smoke, its windows clouded with frost no matter how many fires were lit. The cold also bred sickness. Damp, smoky rooms filled with too many people invited fevers and coughs. Frost-bitten fingers and toes turned black, leading to infections. Children weakened, their bodies unable to produce enough heat to survive. Doctors prescribed hot broths and rest, but these were luxuries few could afford. Warmth had become a medicine in itself, and it was a medicine in short supply. Still, resilience carried through. Families shared secrets of survival, how to trap warmth by sleeping with stones heated in the fire, how to seal chimneys with damp cloth to stop the draft, how to cook soups slowly so steam filled the room. Communities sometimes gathered together in one house, abandoning the others until the frost broke. Though pride resisted at first, people learned that survival demanded closeness, human bodies pressed together, strangers becoming allies against the cold. By March, woodpiles were nearly gone. Forests near towns were stripped bare, their stumps standing like black teeth against the snow. Ash from fires piled high in hearths, the grey dust of countless sacrifices. The struggle for warmth was unending, but it was also a testament to endurance. Every glowing ember, every flicker of flame, was proof that the frost could be resisted, if only for one more night. The Great Frost of 1709 was not just a season of hunger. It was a season of fire, of fires too small, too costly, too fragile, yet stubbornly kept alive by hands that refused to surrender. Against the endless cold, people built islands of warmth, however brief, however small. And those islands kept them alive. The Great Frost of 1709 did not strike all people equally. Cold and hunger came for everyone, but the way they endured depended on wealth, status, and what resources they could reach. In those weeks of endless winter, the gulf between rich and poor grew sharper than ever before. For the poor, survival was immediate and brutal. Their homes were small and thin-walled, their clothes patched and worn, their food supplies meager even in ordinary years. When the frost came, it stripped them bare in days. Families huddled together in single rooms, burning furniture for warmth. Children went barefoot on icy floors, their feet wrapped in rags. Meals shrank from loaves and stews to scraps and broth, then to nothing at all. Hunger hollowed them quickly, and death often arrived quietly in the night. Markets only deepened the divide. Grain, already scarce, became impossibly expensive. A loaf of bread that once cost a few coins now demanded a week's wages. Poor families sold what little they had, blankets, tools, heirlooms, for food that barely lasted a day. Some turned to begging, their voices hoarse from cold, hands outstretched in frozen streets. Others scavenged in desperation, stripping bark from trees, boiling leather scraps, eating whatever could be swallowed. The wealthy lived differently, though not without fear. In their palaces and manor houses, fires burned constantly. Servants kept logs stacked high, hauled coal, and sealed rooms with curtains to trap the heat. Beds were layered with furs, tables still set with meat, bread, and wine, though portions grew smaller as stores dwindled. Nobles wore silks lined with velvet and fur, their jewels glittering in candlelight even as frost crept across windows. Outwardly, they maintained a show of control, as though their status might shield them from nature's cruelty. Yet wealth had its limits. Food supplies that could be bought in the first weeks ran out as trade collapsed. Imported luxuries rotted or froze in warehouses. Even the richest kitchens struggled when rivers froze, cutting off shipments of grain and wine. Meat grew scarce as livestock died. Servants shivered in drafty halls, and nobles found that no number of fireplaces could truly push back the frost. The cold humbled all, though the poor bore its weight first and hardest. Resentment simmered beneath the surface. In villages, peasants whispered that nobles feasted while children starved. In cities, riots broke out, fueled by anger at grain merchants and wealthy families who seemed untouched by the suffering. Some nobles tried to calm the unrest by distributing food and fuel, but their charity was often too little for too many. Others locked their gates, fearing the desperation of the crowds outside. But not all contrasts were stark. In some places, nobles and priests opened stores of grain to share with the poor, risking their own supplies to prevent starvation. Wealthy families sometimes hosted villagers in their barns or halls, providing warmth for those with none. These acts of generosity did not erase the suffering, but they reminded people that survival was a shared burden. For if the frost continued long enough, even the wealthy would fall. The frost blurred boundaries in strange ways. In Versailles, courtiers wrapped themselves in furs and still shivered, no different from peasants in straw-filled clothes. In London, nobles dined in candlelit halls, but their breath still smoked in the air. In Vienna, the emperor himself held court in rooms so cold that ink froze in wells. Kings and beggars alike learned that crowns and coins could not command the weather. And yet, inequality left its scars. The poor buried their dead in shallow graves, while nobles arranged proper funerals with priests and candles. The poor scavenged for warmth, while the wealthy burned wood with abandon. The poor sold their last possessions for a loaf, while nobles bartered jewels for cartloads of grain. The frost was universal, but suffering was uneven. Still, in the memory of survivors, the frost became a great equalizer. Everyone, no matter their station, knew what it meant to fear the cold, to ration food, to pray for spring. Peasants spoke of nobles who trembled like common men. Nobles remembered the silence of streets where beggars once cried out. For one season, the frost had stripped away illusions. Humanity stood naked before nature, and wealth offered only a temporary shield. The Great Frost of 1709 revealed many truths. It showed the resilience of the poor, who endured with scraps and stubborn will. It exposed the fragility of the rich, whose luxuries cracked like frozen glass. And it reminded all that survival is never certain, no matter the weight of gold. As the weeks dragged on, both poor and wealthy came to understand the same truth: they could not outspend, outfight, or outwit the frost. They could only endure it, one day at a time. And for many, that endurance was all that separated life from death. The Great Frost of 1709 was not only a trial of homes, markets, and families. It was also a test of kingdoms. Across Europe, rulers who once measured their power by armies and gold suddenly faced a force beyond their command. Politics, already strained by wars and rivalries, bent under the weight of famine, cold, and unrest. At the time, Europe was locked in the War of the Spanish Succession, a conflict that stretched from the fields of Italy to the Low Countries and beyond. Armies marched, battles raged, treaties were debated. But when the frost came, war itself froze. Camps turned into graveyards as soldiers huddled in thin tents, their rations gone, their bodies stiff with cold. Horses, vital for cavalry and transport, collapsed by the thousands. Supply lines snapped as rivers iced over and roads became impassable. Soldiers deserted, slipping back to villages in search of food, leaving generals powerless. In some places, the frost ended campaigns more effectively than any battle. Governments faced a different kind of war, one against despair within their own borders. In France, Louis XIV had spent decades building his image as the Sun King, a monarch whose brilliance outshone all others. But in the winter of 1709, his kingdom shivered in darkness. Reports reached him daily of starving peasants, rioting towns, and ruined fields. Grain prices soared so high that even Parisian merchants whispered that the king had lost control. Louis ordered days of prayer, demanded that grain be rationed, and sent soldiers to guard stores. Yet none of these measures could thaw the frozen soil or bring back the harvest. The king's power, so long seen as absolute, seemed suddenly fragile. In England, Queen Anne and her ministers faced the same challenge. The Thames lay frozen, trade slowed, and food shortages grew. Parliament debated relief measures, but politics was as divided as ever. Whigs and Tories argued, each blaming the other for mismanaging supplies. Meanwhile, ordinary Londoners braved hunger and cold, less concerned with politics than with survival. The frost showed that even the grand debates of government could be silenced by the simple need for bread. In the Holy Roman Empire, Emperor Joseph I tried to maintain stability, but famine stirred unrest in German states. Grain riots erupted, peasants stormed storehouses, and local rulers struggled to contain anger. Authority itself seemed to tremble in the cold. People who had long accepted their place in society now questioned why kings feasted while children starved, why armies were fed while villages went hungry. The frost exposed the fragility of loyalty, the thin line between obedience and rebellion. For smaller kingdoms and principalities, the frost was even more devastating. In Poland, Sweden, and the Baltic states, already battered by war and harsh climates, the freeze deepened suffering until some regions teetered on collapse. Local lords abandoned their estates, unable to support their tenants. Town councils pleaded for aid that never came. Hunger bred suspicion, and suspicion bred violence. Foreign diplomats wrote letters describing a continent on edge, where one spark might ignite rebellion. And yet, the frost was impartial. It struck king and beggar alike. Even rulers, for all their palaces, felt its sting. In Versailles, courtiers whispered that Louis himself shivered in his chambers, wrapped in layers of fur. In Vienna, ink froze in the wells of clerks, slowing the machinery of empire. In London, members of Parliament wore gloves indoors, their breath rising in clouds as they argued. Authority remained, but it looked suddenly small against the vast, unfeeling cold. The political consequences reached far beyond the winter itself. The famine that followed weakened entire populations, reducing the strength of armies and draining treasuries. Taxes, already heavy from war, became unbearable for starving subjects. Resentment toward rulers grew, sowing seeds of distrust that would echo in later decades. Some historians would later call the frost a quiet turning point, a season when kings learned how vulnerable they truly were, and when subjects glimpsed how fragile their ruler's power could be. But in the moment, the frost's politics were simple: survival first, authority second. Laws mattered less than loaves. Decrees mattered less than firewood. Kings and councils could not command the weather, and in that helplessness lay a truth that every peasant already knew: nature ruled all. The great frost of 1709 froze more than rivers and fields. It froze politics, halting wars, silencing debates, and humbling rulers. It showed that crowns and thrones, though glittering, were powerless before the breath of winter. And when the thaw finally came, Europe would not only rise from the ice, it would rise changed, its rulers reminded that their power, though vast, was never absolute. By March of 1709, whispers of change stirred across Europe. The night still bit hard, the mornings still cut like knives, but the sun lingered a little longer each day. Snow softened at the edges. Icicles dripped. The rivers, once silent plains of ice, began to groan and crack as the water beneath pressed upward, restless. For weeks, people had prayed for this moment, the first sign that the frost's grip might be breaking. And yet, when the thaw finally came, it was no gentle relief. The rivers swelled, breaking their icy prisons with violent force. Chunks of ice the size of carts tore downstream, smashing bridges, flooding banks, sweeping away homes that had somehow survived the cold. Fields, once frozen solid, turned into swamps of mud and rot. The thaw revealed what the frost had hidden: the full scale of ruin. Across France, peasants walked their land in silence, staring at devastation. Crops that had been planted the year before lay dead beneath the soil. Vines in Bordeaux and Burgundy were ruined, their twisted branches brittle, lifeless. Olive groves in Provence, once the pride of southern fields, had withered completely. Farmers knew at once there would be no harvest this year. Famine would not vanish with the frost. It was only beginning. In towns and cities, the thaw uncovered grim truths. Snow melted to reveal bodies in the streets, those who had frozen unnoticed, buried under drifts. In rivers, corpses floated alongside shattered boats, their faces preserved in ice until the moment they rose. The death toll, already felt by every family, now became undeniable. Entire neighborhoods seemed thinner, quieter, emptier. Hunger deepened even as the cold lessened. Stores were gone. Grain had been eaten or hoarded. Livestock had died in barns. Villagers dug into the soil for anything salvageable, only to find it barren. Bread remained scarce, prices impossibly high. People who had survived the frost now faced the crueler truth: survival was not guaranteed in the months ahead. The famine that followed the frost would claim as many lives, if not more, than the winter itself. Governments struggled to respond. In France, Louis XIV ordered grain imported at great cost, but it was too little for too many. Riots flared in cities where hungry crowds demanded bread. In England, Parliament debated relief while the poor lined up at churches for scraps of food. Across the German states, local rulers pleaded with one another for aid, though none had much to give. Diplomats who once discussed treaties and wars now spoke of famine relief, their letters carrying the scent of despair. And yet, amid the grief, there was also resilience. Families replanted what little they could, scratching at the soil with renewed determination. Communities banded together, pooling resources, sharing tools, rebuilding barns and fences torn down for firewood. Churches, though emptied of grain, offered comfort and ritual, guiding people through mourning. Survivors buried their dead and then turned their faces back toward life, because there was no other choice. The frost had also left marks that would last for generations. Vineyards destroyed in 1709 never fully recovered, changing the course of European wine production. Olive groves vanished from regions that had grown them for centuries. Forests stripped for firewood took decades to regrow. The economy of entire nations was reshaped, trade routes altered, industries weakened. The frost had left scars not just on bodies, but on landscapes and economies alike. Memory, too, became part of the aftermath. For years afterward, people spoke of the Great Winter, passing down stories of hunger and cold. Children who had survived grew into adults who remembered huddling by dying fires, gnawing on crusts, watching their parents weep over empty cupboards. Priests recorded the frost in parish registers, noting the surge of burials, the collapse of marriages and baptisms, the silence of weddings. Scholars wrote of it in chronicles, measuring temperatures, counting losses, marking it as the coldest winter Europe had ever known. And yet, spring did come. Flowers pushed through thawing ground, timid at first, then bold. Birds returned, their songs piercing the silence that had hung over the land. Rivers flowed again, though they carried the memory of ice in their currents. Farmers bent to their plows, however hopeless the soil seemed. Merchants reopened stalls, their tables bare at first but soon filling with what little goods could be found. Life, stubborn as ever, crept back into a continent scarred by winter. The people of Europe had endured. They had prayed, burned, begged, and buried, and still they stood when the frost receded. They were weaker, hungrier, and poorer, but they were alive. And in their survival lay the quiet triumph of humanity against nature's fiercest test. The aftermath of the Great Frost was not measured only in loss. It was measured in endurance. In the families who survived on thin soups and shared blankets. In the neighbors who split their last loaf in two. In the peasants who returned to barren fields and planted again anyway. The frost had taken so much, but it had not taken hope entirely. For as the sun warmed the earth once more, people looked upward with gratitude and relief. They knew now how fragile life was, how quickly it could be stolen by forces beyond their control. But they also knew the strength that could be found in endurance, in community, in faith. The Great Frost had scarred Europe, but it had not broken it. And so, as spring unfolded, Europe mourned, rebuilt, and endured. The frost had passed, but its memory would never melt. The Great Frost of 1709 has long since melted into history, yet its memory lingers like the chill of a long night. For those who endured it, the frost was not just a season of cold, it was a trial that revealed the limits of the body, the fragility of society, and the depths of the human spirit. It was, in every sense, a lesson in endurance. The first lesson was humility. For centuries, kings and peasants alike believed they had mastered the rhythms of the world. They planted, harvested, traded, and fought, certain that human order could tame the unpredictability of life. But when the frost came, it swept away those illusions. Thrones could not command the weather. Armies could not march against ice. Gold could not buy food when there was no food left to sell. The frost reminded Europe that nature was not a servant, but a sovereign. And in its rule, all people were equal. The second lesson was community. Alone, few could have survived. Fires burned longer when families huddled together. Soup stretched further when neighbors shared their last handfuls of grain. Priests opened church stores. Monks fed the hungry from their cloisters. Even nobles, in some places, offered grain to their tenants, understanding that their own survival depended on the survival of the people who worked their land. The frost showed that endurance was not only about strength, but about solidarity. Those who stood together endured longer than those who faced the cold alone. The third lesson was resilience. People adapted in ways they could never have imagined. They lined their clothes with straw. They burned furniture for warmth. They ground acorns into flour, mixed sawdust with bread, melted snow for water, and made meals from scraps no one would have considered food in ordinary times. They turned barns into shelters, filled with both people and animals, creating warmth where none existed. They found ways to survive not because they had abundance, but because they refused to surrender. The frost revealed the ingenuity that hides in desperation, the creativity of survival itself. The fourth lesson was memory. The frost carved itself into the stories of those who lived through it, carried into parish records, chronicles, and family tales told by firelight in the decades that followed. Children who grew up in 1709 became adults who told their own children of the winter when bread was stone and rivers were glass. For them, the frost was not only an event, it was a warning, a reminder of how fragile life could be, and how precious each season of warmth and plenty truly was. And perhaps the final lesson was hope. For all its cruelty, the frost eventually ended. Spring did return. Birds sang again. Fields, though ruined, were planted anew. Families that had buried loved ones still found reasons to go on. Hope was not loud in those days, it was quiet, fragile, and trembling, like the first green shoot pushing through thawing earth. But it was enough. Enough to keep fires burning through the night. Enough to carry people across the silence of hunger. Enough to remind them that endurance was not only about surviving the present, but believing in the future. Looking back, the Great Frost stands as the coldest winter in Europe's recorded history. But its true legacy lies not in the temperature it reached, nor in the famine it caused, but in the people who endured it. Ordinary men and women who, with little more than scraps and stubbornness, survived a season that seemed determined to erase them. They remind us that endurance is not about strength without weakness, but about persistence despite weakness. Not about triumph over nature, but about harmony with its cycles, to bend, adapt, and survive. As the frost melted into memory, Europe was forever changed. Vineyards regrew, but not all. Forests returned, but thinner. Economies recovered, but slowly. And the people who lived through it carried invisible scars, the kind that shape how generations think of hunger, cold, and survival. The frost became a story told across firesides and in churches, a lesson whispered to children, a warning passed down through time. Even now, more than 3 centuries later, the Great Frost of 1709 reminds us of truths we would rather forget, that life is fragile, that the world can change in a single night, that survival is never guaranteed. But it also leaves us with a gentler truth, that human beings, when pressed to their limits, can endure almost anything. In the silence of that winter, when death was everywhere and hope was scarce, people found ways to hold on. And that, perhaps, is the greatest lesson of all.